In this three-part series of videos, we're going to look at the homeostatic regulation of the body's metabolism. This video will focus specifically on catabolic regulation, or the regulation of catabolism, which are regulation of the chemical reactions that involve the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller ones, such as glycogen and triglycerides, broken down into glucose and fatty acids, both of which have very important functions in producing energy for the body. In the second two videos, we're going to look at the regulation of anabolism, or anabolic chemical reactions, which, as the opposite of catabolic ones, involve the buildup of smaller molecules into much larger ones, usually through dehydration synthesis. Again, these are particularly important during large periods of growth of the human body, particularly during puberty. Now, the most important regulatory organ for catabolic regulation is a gland that we call the thyroid gland, which is found just above the windpipe of the body, the trachea, right below the larynx, the organ used for human voice production. However, just like most important regulatory glands in the human body, the thyroid gland cannot actually function independently. Instead, it takes instructions indirectly from the most important regulatory organ of the endocrine system, the hypothalamus. Now, just like the way that the hypothalamus regulates the reproductive system, the hypothalamus doesn't actually regulate the thyroid gland directly. Instead, it produces another regulatory hormone that stimulates the pituitary gland, and it's the pituitary gland that is used to regulate the thyroid gland directly. And the name of the hormone that the hypothalamus produces to activate the pituitary gland is the rather awkwardly named thyrotropin releasing hormone. Now, this has a similar function to GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, in that this is the hormone that stimulates the pituitary gland, and just like with GnRH, we can give thyrotropin releasing hormone an easier to understand initialism, which we will henceforth know as TRH. Now, once TRH is released from the hypothalamus and activates the pituitary gland, it tells the pituitary gland to start producing another regulatory hormone, which is going to impact the thyroid gland directly, and it is what we call thyroid stimulating hormone. And this name actually is rather helpful in telling us what the hormone actually does, in that it is a hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland in order to become active, and we can give it another easy to understand initialism. TSH is what we will call thyroid stimulating hormone, which again is released from the pituitary gland and travels to the thyroid gland via your circulatory system, activating it to produce the direct effector hormones, that being the hormones produced by the thyroid gland that are able to influence catabolic processes throughout the body on their own. And these have the most unfortunate names to try and remember. The first of these is a hormone called triiodothyroidine, or thyroidine technically, and thyroxine. If you think that these names are awkward to remember, you are not the only one, which is why we will never refer to these as triiodothyroidine and thyroxine again. These hormones will henceforth be known as T3 and T4. And these hormones are the most important regulatory hormones for catabolic processes throughout the body, as they can pretty much have an effect on every single cell, and all of these will directly relate to energy production in some way. Now, T3 and T4, once they've migrated through the blood to basically any other cell in the body, will stimulate an increase in protein synthesis in pretty much every cell. Why is this important? Well, as we know, most of the biological catalysts in the body, enzymes, are made of protein, and the more enzymes we have, that means the faster chemical reactions can occur, specifically the chemical reactions that relate to energy production. In addition to increasing rates of protein synthesis, T3 and T4 will also pretty much trigger every cell in the body to absorb a greater amount of glucose into their cells, because glucose is the primary source of energy that is used to produce adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, and this is particularly important in brain cells, as glucose is the only energy source that brain cells can use. Now, of particular note is the way that T3 and T4 affect storage cells such as hepatocytes, liver cells, and adipocytes, fat cells, as these are influenced by T3 and T4 because there are going to be increased rates of hydrolysis that take place in storage cells such as these. When glycogen is hydrolyzed, that means we're going to get glucose, and the more hydrolysis we have, the more glucose is going to be floating throughout the blood, which can supply energy to cells in the body. And likewise, when triglycerides become hydrolyzed, that means that our body is going to have an increased amount of fatty acids that are made available, and both of these in large quantities can be used to produce large amounts of energy. However, none of these reactions would actually be possible if we did not have enough oxygen in the body, which is why the final effects of T3 and T4 related to catabolism are an increased rate of breathing by increasing the rate at which the diaphragm works so that we can get more oxygen into the body, and an increase in heart rate so that we can speed up the rate of transportation of nutrients throughout the body so that cells that require energy get the energy that they need. Now, obviously, this process is not sustainable, because if this process were to keep going indefinitely, your body would burn through its entire supply of glycogen and fatty acids, exhausting all of its energy reserves. So it's very important that we have a recognizable shutoff system in order to prevent this system from going out of control. And all of this hinges on the fact that T3 and T4, as the thyroid gland produces more of the thyroid hormones, eventually these hormones are going to make their way back up to the brain and influence the hypothalamus once again. And as we've seen in many different occasions, such as with testosterone in the male reproductive system and both estrogen and progesterone in the female reproductive system, T3 and T4 function as an inhibitory signal to the hypothalamus, stopping it from producing thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which means if there is no TRH anymore, the pituitary gland doesn't receive its stimulation from the hypothalamus, meaning that thyroid-stimulating hormone shuts off once again, and if no thyroid-stimulating hormone is present, that means that the thyroid gland doesn't receive its activation signal, and that in turn stops the production of T3 and T4, shutting the entire process down. So as we can see, the more T3 and T4 that is produced by the thyroid gland, the more likely these two hormones are to act as their own inhibitory signal. So this is yet another classic case of negative feedback regulation. In conclusion to this, you can put your knowledge of catabolic regulation to use by investigating this case study on Graves' disease, a common symptom of which is hyperthyroidism, which is an overactivity, or dare I say constant activity, of the thyroid gland. So see if you can read through this case study and put your knowledge of thyroid regulation, of catabolism, to use to see if you can understand how this particular disease works.